debate between people who believe in a God and those who believe in no God, the question of whether the Bible is fiction or non-fiction. But that's not where this question comes up most. It in fact comes up most within Christianity, between people who believe that the Bible is something which was written as tradition hands down at the times it was handed down, versus those who believe, oddly enough, often enough, that the entirety of the Old Testament, the so-called Torah or Pentateuch, and much of the prophets were in fact just scrawled down during the Babylonian exile to give the Jewish people some sort of common culture, and that in fact they did not come from Iran into Egypt and invade and conquer Israel, wiping out the people before them, but instead were Canaanite peoples who had always been in that area and had made up things like Moses and the creation story and so forth. Now, if you look at things such as the fact that Jesus said that Moses allowed divorce, you'd note that Jesus seems to believe that Moses not only existed, but gave the law which is said to be from him, the Levitical law, and the type of laws you will see in books such as Numbers or Deuteronomy and so forth. You'd also see Jesus referencing where the God of Christianity, Yahweh, speaks to Moses and says, "I am the God of Abraham and Isaac," or something along those lines. And Jesus says, if that's what he says, then he's the God of the living. And he didn't say he was the God of those people, he said he is. And if he is the God of the living, then Abraham and Isaac and so forth must be alive in the afterlife. So Jesus again seems to be directly connecting what he believes to Moses and the existence of Moses. And if Jesus believed these things mistakenly, if he was just believing a false religion which was created amongst the Canaanite people who had been taken into exile in the diaspora in Babylon, then Jesus himself could not be God, because he would be basing his own beliefs about God on something which is false. And you also had the Transfiguration, where Jesus spoke, I think it would have been to Elijah and Moses, while in a sort of state where they all appeared very bright. So if you throw out the Old Testament in such a manner, you are throwing out the New Testament with it. Of course, people like to say that in modern days we can't accept the creation narrative in Genesis 1, except it's always been known that the narrative in Genesis 1 contradicts that in that of Adam and Eve, because in Genesis 1 you hear the story of God creating the world in 6 days, and last of all creating mankind on the 6th day. And yet, if you read the story of Adam and Eve, you hear that this took place before any plants had grown on the earth, and in fact that Adam was created then. So that contradiction is there from the beginning. But if you look at Genesis 1 as many a modern scholar might, where you might see it as a metaphor with God's creation compared to a stonemason creating a temple and filling that temple up, you might have a slightly different view of that. You might view it as what Genesis 1 is poetry. It's poetry which is supposed to relay truth, but nonetheless it's in a poetic form. That's the beginning of Genesis. So what is fiction or non-fiction? Well, fiction is, according to Oxford Dictionary of English, and I'm not going to quote it exactly because I don't want to stand here reading to you, I want to stand here speaking to you. So Oxford Dictionary of English defines fiction as literary prose, which is used, especially in the case of novels, which relays events, imaginary events, and events which are imaginary or about imaginary people. So you have this idea within it that firstly it needs to be prose generally. So poetry such as Homer's Iliad and Odyssey would probably go within poetry in a library following the modern variations from the duodecimal system. And then it would need to be something along the lines of something which is about imaginary people or imaginary events. So it has to be a creation of the person who's writing it. It has to be something new. So what could not be fiction would be something like Origen's relaying of the Greek myths, which he believed were revealed to him by a muse, by a spirit within ancient Greece. That wouldn't be fiction. That would go within the section of a library for philosophy and religion, as would most myths, in fact. Myths would tend to go within the non-fiction section. And religion, whether it is the Bible or the Quran, would also go within the non-fiction section of a library. So the Bible isn't a novel, and it isn't a book of novels. Is it perhaps a myth or a book of myths? So we need to look then within non-fiction, where it should be placed. Is the Bible some sort of good historic record, or is it not a history book, as people often say nowadays? But I don't think those people who say that have ever really looked at proper history books. They haven't looked at the stories of what happened in various parts of the Peloponnesian Wars or things like that. They haven't looked and seen what happened, for instance, when Hannibal came over the Alps. And they haven't realized that if you read the different stories on that, they contradict each other. And if you read the different accounts of the life story, the biography of Alexander the Great, you'll see that they contradict one another. And if you read histories of Caesar, you'll see they contradict each other. If you look at all of these historic actual manuscripts, they're quite contradictory. They're not these perfect records of history. And if you look at something like the Bible, which was quite well preserved, and I don't say that in the sense that Islamic scholars claim that the Quran is quite well preserved, and then you simply see that there are dozens of versions of the Quran in Arabic which are badly preserved and which weren't destroyed but still exist, but that most go with the Cairo translation. I'm talking about the fact that what was recorded within the Old Testament and the New Testament, as we know with the Old Testament from the Dead Sea Scrolls, was quite well preserved. You obviously have the two major translations we know of today of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of Hebrew, which supposedly was translated by between 70 and 72 scholars for the Library of Alexandria, and when they came up with the same translation, apparently the library was happy. Or you would have the Hebrew version of it, which might well have been a later version translating what was there earlier. Though when you look at it, you have these people who say, okay, well, this was all written in the exile in Babylon, and we can tell it because there's different dialects between the north and the south of Israel, which are present there. But was this Hebrew the original Hebrew? Because it doesn't seem like it was. Firstly, the Septuagint and that Hebrew version differ slightly. Yes, what we have with the Septuagint and what we have with the Hebrew has been preserved for 2,000 years until the present, if not more than 2,000 years in some cases. But what would Moses have been writing in if indeed he had written the original Torah books? He'd probably be writing in an Egyptian script, because Hebrew, according to scholars of language, only emerged at about 800 BC. So if you have Moses, he'd be writing in something else, and the Ten Commandments would be in something else. It wouldn't be in a script which hadn't emerged yet, which hadn't formed from other languages into a written script. It would be something akin to ancient Egyptian, perhaps, which, as we know, the hieroglyphs, in fact, relay sound. They don't just relay pictures. And so you might well find that something was there which was translated into Hebrew, and then glosses were added onto it, such as this still is here, this is still the case here, by later translators. But what you have there is a very flawed argument, and often you seem to find these flawed arguments for things being fiction. For instance, you have the argument that the book of Jonah must be fiction, because for a fish or sea creature to swallow someone and then to push them up 3 days later is impossible. What you call the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Is that possible then? Because if you believe that a God exists, then inevitably you must believe that any intervention that God does with the course of events in the ordinary world must be supernatural. It can't simply be things following in their ordinary course, because then there's no intervention from God at all. Except perhaps in the sense that he allows the world to continue to exist and to continue following the same rules. So you have this odd sort of objection which emerges that things must be false for that reason, or things must be false because archaeological evidence can't be found for a certain city as having been somewhere, when that city is recorded in the biblical narrative as having been destroyed 5,000 years ago. Now we don't know what it is which makes certain things last, which makes the pyramids last, which makes various other things last through the millennia. We don't know where the records of most of humanity are for most of the supposed hundreds of thousands of years we've existed. Very few things seem to last, and yet, because certain cities might not be found, we have to suddenly discount a tradition, a means of transferring information from generation to generation, whether that tradition, that handing down, was of a written text in the form of scrolls on parchment, or whether that handing down was in the form of something oral. Now, before this Dead Sea Scrolls were found, we didn't have anything even near Jesus' time recording these various parts of the biblical narrative. We've only had much later ones, because continuously what was recorded in writing was copied down in writing and handed down, and it seems like the people who did that did a good job, because what we still have today is almost entirely the same text with slight details different. Of course, when it comes to the New Testament, the church in about 300 and something AD, when they compiled the New Testament and adopted mostly the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, in that St. Jerome was told to translate that, even though he had objections to it because parts of the Septuagint were not present in the Hebrew, and so he wanted to know if he should also translate those books, and it was decided that he should. But with the New Testament, you have your 3 synoptic Gospels, and the 4th Gospel, the Gospel of John, which records the view of someone who was believed to be an apostle of Jesus, who lived with him for the 3 years or whatever it was that he had his preaching ministry before being crucified. The 3 synoptic Gospels are called that because in almost every respect they are almost identical in the way they relay what Jesus said and what Jesus did, just using slightly different words every now and then, but overall having very similar texts, almost like people were copying each other's homework. Now, where these texts differ, you would have this idea of, oh, that's just, they have fabricated something or other. But if it is indeed the case that they were copying each other's homework, that one author saw the other and copied that mostly, and then changed certain slight things, these are authors who would have been communicating with the people who were eyewitnesses of the events. And in all likelihood, if they've differed from a different author of it, it's because they disagree with him. Now you might say, oh, that means the Bible is not divine, but the Bible isn't the Quran. The Quran, we know, obviously, is believed to have been handed down from heaven as an eternal document to Islam's Prophet Muhammad, who in turn had it recorded by scribes by relaying it to them, or else spoke of things it said, and these were recorded, and the Quran was compiled based on that. Within Christianity, the Bible is believed to be written by people who have interacted with God, of their experiences of God, with God doing some general safeguarding to make sure that what's relayed, as far as it relays what is useful for salvation or morals or useful about God, is relayed correctly. And where you see the Bible relaying things such as the stories of King David, you see that it includes very negative things about the people involved in it. It includes things that King David and various other kings did wrong and did evilly. So it's not this sort of whitewashed work, and it's not a classical work of fiction, either in the sense of the technical sense or in the sense of something which is clearly fabricated. So the idea that the Bible contains fictional books rather than books which might follow a different format or might give messages in a different way or might show lessons in a different way is one which is technically false. As regarding whether or not things such as the Book of Jonah really happened, well, you need to realize that other sources or other methods of trying to look that far back into the past are also quite unreliable. And if you're looking at the Odyssey, you might say, okay, well, there's a lot of things happening here which don't seem possible, which seem supernatural. And yet we accept nowadays, having finally made the discovery of where Troy would have been, that the Iliad and Odyssey relay in some form or other real events. And most history from that time in history is a bit strange in the way it's recorded. It's recorded from a different perspective of what truth might mean. So that to a modern person you might have this very analytical, very chronological type of view, the sort of tyranny of the clock which we have in the Western world. But if you look at pre-Enlightenment people, they would view things slightly differently. They would view things from a more symbolic type of viewpoint, by which I don't mean symbolic as in not real. I mean symbolic as in things connect in a different way. And where things are true, they will often enough be symbolically true and perhaps also actually true. But what you're looking at is a different way of viewing the world and getting your mindset into that sort of way of viewing the world. Where, for instance, you might at times say that everyone was killed by this and that, and then you find there's actually survivors later. Or you might have all sorts of other things which emerge from a text. But it's almost as though people who spend their lives becoming priests or cardinals or bishops or whatever else it is, then view the text which they supposedly base their lives on with such skepticism and such a secular type of viewpoint that it's a type of viewpoint a skepticism that they wouldn't apply to anything else. It's almost a sort of embarrassment at the original text. All the while, of course, having this approach of always trusting scholars or archaeologists, when scholars and archaeologists are simply people who have certain equipment, certain means, and certain abilities. But when their arguments are not cogent, it's not a good idea to follow them if you think that you're actually following something which is supposed to be about a real God or a real afterlife. It only really makes sense to follow so-called science involving religion blindly rather than with a good dose of rationality, when you in fact are not really following it as someone who believes it at all, but as someone who is perhaps rather wanting to act out a role, or perhaps who decided that they were going to become a priest or something and went through seminary and lost their belief, but thought it was too late to back out. If you genuinely believe in the Bible or the biblical narrative, a lot of the things which theologians seem to be pushing out, like, for instance, one of the bizarre ones is that Moses actually went through a marsh called the Reed Sea instead of the Red Sea, and this is what's really relayed, and that he didn't really make the sea part. But then in the book of Joshua, shortly afterwards, you have a story of the Ark of the Covenant being taken into the river, the Jordan River, before Jericho, and the waters being lifted up like a wall, and the people crossing. And the Bible relaying that this is like what happened with Moses. Now, Joshua and Moses were alive at the same time. Moses obviously died before Joshua, but what's being recorded is that Joshua, in fact, did the same sort of miracle there as Moses did when they were leaving Egypt. And yet, these same scholars would say, no, 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 he just took them out of Egypt via marshes, and Pharaoh, whose men were trained and able, were not able to get through the marshes, but they were. Or else you hear that, oh no, it was just this very shallow little part of the sea which somehow drowns an entire army. So you have these not so cogent arguments. But let's get back to whether or not the Bible or books of the Bible are fiction. None of them meet either the definition of modern Western libraries or the definition of the Oxford Dictionary of English for being fiction. Whether or not the Bible's events are actually true is a different question. But this over-reliance you often see on certain types of archaeology, which every now and then there's a new discovery which changes absolutely everything, because in fact most things that have happened in the past we don't actually discover with archaeology. They disappear. Most parts of human history have disappeared into the sands of time. And archaeology is weak in that form. If it weren't for that locket and those two small little texts being discovered from before the Babylonian exile, which were discovered quite by chance, but in fact were eventually discovered and found in the original environment in the grave, then you might well have had this claim of everything being made up in the Babylonian exile being something which could sound valid and very valid, and yet you have a recording of the priestly blessing recorded accurately in scroll form inside a locket from before then. And yet you'd often find then that, oh no, just everything else, or the law portion is just made up in exile. Because the very people who often will make these arguments or will believe these arguments and who dedicate their life to studying a sort of religion that supposedly they believe in will often in fact be doing all they can to find the most trendy or fashionable way of the day to disbelieve in as much as possible for the virtue signal of saying, I don't really believe any of this, but I believe it, and somehow that makes me a better person, a virtuous person, because I don't actually believe it, or I believe it to the smallest degree possible. I think that for me, it makes more sense to look into the history, into the tradition which is handed down to us for thousands of years, and which seems to have been accurately handed down to us in the form of the Septuagint and the Hebrew text. And by the way, there's also that very discredited theory that only the Alexandrian Jews, only the Greek-speaking Jews, not the ones in Palestine, would in fact have read the Septuagint, and yet we've recently had another discovery from a few hundred years after Jesus of a group of Jews in Palestine who starved to death in a cave, starved to death with what looks like Greek of the Bible, perhaps. So the more you look into these theories, it's almost as though the biblical scholars come up with all of these wild theories, and then after coming up with these wild theories that everything must have a human explanation of sociological explanation, that often the archaeology comes up and is an unfortunate truth, because it makes the actual documents which we have make a lot more sense versus the theories of these various scholars who think that they are very grand in the way that they are relaying things, and yet who often seem to be missing the point of everything. And if they were studying any other text, as C.S. Lewis would point out, would be studying it in a way that nobody would accept what they're saying.